Yeah, so my name is Marc Burnard, and I'm a security researcher in the C2 Cyber Intelligence Cell. And today I'll be talking about the evolving threat from China. So there's often a view that Chinese threat groups are more prolific than sophisticated, and while that historically has been true, there's certainly greater variability now. And today I'm going to demonstrate some observations around how Chinese threat groups are showing kind of a higher level of sophistication and greater consideration around sort of operational security as part of their campaigns. We're going to touch upon sort of strategic context around some of that, and then we're going to look at and do a deep dive around technical observations. And finally, throughout the presentation, I'm going to link all of this to implications for network defenders where possible. So strategic context. Well, one significant development in China that was announced in 2015 is the widespread and extensive reforms by the PLA, so that's the People's Liberation Army, which is the Chinese military, and they have a well-documented cyber espionage capability, and there were direct implications of these reforms on the cyber espionage units within the People's Liberation Army. One of the key aspects of the reforms is the move to 5 theatre commands. As you can see, they're mapped onto China. And these theatre commands are responsible for the military kind of units, the military branches within their regions. And they're also responsible for the technical reconnaissance bureaus, so bureaus that are sort of tasked with signals intelligence and cyber espionage. We're saying that the theatre commands are focused on generally the countries that border their region. So an example is the Western Theatre Command, which is sort of responsible for kind of countries like India, Afghanistan, and multiple Central Asian countries. One of the other key aspects of the PLA reforms was the standing up of the Strategic Support Force. This is the fifth branch of the PLA that has incorporated most of the cyber espionage units, possibly including the technical reconnaissance bureaus that operate out of the theatre commands, but at very least they appear to be working closely together. And then from the analysis of Chinese threat group activity over the past year or so, with a particular focus on ShadowPad, we have identified operations that appear to align with expected targeting by theatre commands. And one exception to this is possibly the Central Theatre Command, which is mainly tasked with protecting Beijing and supporting other theatre commands. So ShadowPad is a remote access Trojan that's being used by an increasing number of Chinese threat groups. And as part of our analysis, we identified distinct clusters of ShadowPad activity that overlap with the expected behavior by theatre commands across China. So one example was the Western Theatre Command, and we identified sort of unique ShadowPad versions and infrastructure seen in multiple campaigns targeting India, Central Asian countries, and Afghanistan, and we sort of mapped that to the Western Theatre Command and groups operating out of that region. Another example is where we've seen sort of closer collaboration amongst groups that are now part of the same theatre command. So one example is Bronze Butler and Bronze Huntley that we've reported on extensively. They're both now operating out of the Northern Theatre Command. The Northern Theatre Command is sort of responsible for countries like Mongolia, Russia, South Korea, and Japan as well, we think. And these two groups, Bronze Butler and Bronze Huntley, are certainly demonstrating closer collaboration and overlap. So we've seen evidence of overlap in terms of both infrastructure and malware families, and that includes specific ShadowPad versions. So we are seeing this sort of evidence of distinct threat groups that are now likely part of the same theatre command that are aligning along the theatre command lines, and from a network defender perspective, that will likely translate into sort of identical observables aligned to previously distinct threat groups. So tactics, techniques, procedures will appear to be the same, and that may suggest that we may see over the coming years a kind of move to this sort of idea of intrusion supersets, where previously distinct threat groups like Bronze Butler and Bronze Huntley appear effectively to network defenders as the same threat group. There are some implications for defense around this. So if you have one of these groups in your sort of threat model, it's worth then perhaps incorporating threat groups that are operating in alignment with the same theatre command into your threat modeling as well, because as the evidence shows, it appears that these threat groups are aligning more closely and are using the same malware, using the same infrastructure. So that's something that I would sort of recommend for network defenders. Moving on to execution chains. So we have seen an evolution in execution chains, mostly with a view to sort of avoiding detection and slowing down incident response and reverse engineering processes. We're going to use a specific example from a threat group called Bronze Atlas, and we observed this activity earlier on this year, and they used this execution chain to effectively load a Cobalt Strike payload directly into memory. Bronze Atlas is a Chinese threat group that has been active for a number of years, primarily focusing on kind of the theft of intellectual property against organizations globally. And this group was subject to a US Department of Justice indictment last year, which allegedly linked them to the Ministry of State Security, which is the civilian intelligence agency in China. One of the things here is that while they may not be the sort of PLA group, we do believe that they are possibly the original developers of the ShadowPad malware. At the very least, they appear to be closely aligned with the original developers of ShadowPad, if they're not. First, I'm going to focus on sort of Trinity execution chains. You've seen this execution chain used by multiple threat groups for many years. It involves sort of 3 files being deployed to compromised hosts across the network. And the first step is a legitimate executable is executed by the threat actor, and we've seen different legitimate executables used across the years. But they all have one thing in common, is that they're all vulnerable to DLL search order hijacking, which means when they're executed, they'll look to load a DLL with a specific file name from the same directory they're loaded from. And the threat actor has effectively deployed a DLL with that file name to the same directory. So that DLL gets loaded by the legitimate executable. That DLL created by the threat actor is designed to then load and decrypt an encrypted payload. That's the third file, which is also found in the same directory. And in some of the cases, we'll then see that payload being injected into a memory like SVC host or Explorer. You've got showing an image there at the bottom of the slide where we saw this execution chain used in recent Bronze Medley, another Chinese threat group's activity, and they use this to deploy the Whitebird remote access Trojan. Worth saying that once this sort of activity has been detected, it's relatively straightforward for incident response to kind of scope out the malicious activity on the network. So what you generally see with this type of execution chain is the 3 files deployed to hosts across the network, usually to the same directory under program data, and it's quite easy to sort of detect and identify that across the network. And also from a sandbox perspective, if you can sort of package these up and get these into a sandbox, most sandbox solutions will detonate the whole sort of chain without too many difficulties, therefore sort of giving you that automated output of key indicators from the malware in terms of the malware family that's deployed at the end of the execution chain, and command and control domains or IP addresses. What I wanted to do is compare and contrast that to the execution chain we saw Bronze Atlas using earlier on this year, and you can see sort of it mapped out here, and I'm going to go through this sort of step by step so you understand what's going on with this. So step 1 involves Bronze Atlas deploying the TS-VIP SRV DLL to the Windows System32 directory on a compromised host, and then starting or restarting the session env Windows service. And this service is vulnerable to DLL hijacking, which means that it will look for a DLL with that name in the Windows System32 directory, and if it finds it, it will load it. And Bronze Atlas has developed this loader that gets executed by the session env service. So once that loader is executed, the first step is that the loader will identify and locate a file that's in a different directory that's configured in the loader. And in this case, what it will do is we'll reach into that file and will extract and decrypt the encrypted payload. Now, as a network defender, if I were to look at this file, and you can see output from the tool SigCheck on the right-hand side, you would see that it appears to be a verified signed Windows executable. So the question is, well, what's going on here? Well, this relates to MS13098, which is an issue in the way that Windows handles digital signature verifications for executable. And the issue with this is that you can add data to certain sections within a signed executable without affecting the digital signature check. And we've seen threat actors like Bronze Atlas sort of exploiting this vulnerability to embed encrypted payloads into signed executables without affecting the digital signature. Interestingly, this is actually an optional update for Windows hosts. After Microsoft released this in, I think it was in 2013, they came out and said that it impacted software too much, so they made this an opt-in feature. So out of the box, Windows hosts won't necessarily have this security update applied. So on most hosts, if you were to inspect this file, you would see that it appears to be a legitimate executable, although unusual because it's called ntuse.dat and it's in the C users public directory. I think what's going on here is the threat actor is sort of paying attention to, okay, if a network defender were to inspect this file, what would they see? So from a human analyst sort of analysis perspective, this may be overlooked if it's not sort of dug into too deeply. But also, I think they've designed this in order to possibly circumvent automated detection pipelines. So with some security solutions, what you'll have is unknown or previously unseen executables being uploaded to sandbox environments and detonated to determine whether or not they are malicious. And what I think might be going on here is that there's sort of using this MS13098 vulnerability, they are attempting to sort of perhaps circumvent these automated processing sort of steps that may just flag this up as a legitimately signed executable without necessarily alerting on it. So there are two sort of perhaps design considerations there from the Chinese threat group Bronze Atlas. So the next step is process creation. Here we have the process being created, synchost.exe. We saw multiple different processes being created as part of this execution chain on multiple hosts, but it creates a host to step 2 in a suspended state. Step 3 is a technique known as DL hollowing. This is where the loader will iterate through DLLs in the Windows System 32 directory, and it's looking for a DLL that's large enough to contain the code section for the decrypted payload from step 1. And in this case, on Windows 10 hosts, we saw that the first DLL time and time again was AAD cloud ap.dll. Once the loader's found that DLL, it will map that into the sync host process and then overwrite the code section in the DLL with the decrypted payload, and then pass execution to that process, and in particular the DLL, and therefore launching the Cobalt Strike payload directly in memory. So if we compare and contrast between the two execution chains, we see that with the Bronze Atlas execution chain, there's greater consideration around sort of variation in terms of the location of the encrypted payload. Again, that varied depending on the loader and the host. And we also see variation in the process that is injected into as part of the DLL hollowing process. That was different based on the initial loader and the host as well. Also covered sort of payload concealment. Comparing that to the Trinity execution chain, we're not just seeing sort of a standalone file with a data blob that is then loaded into memory and decrypted. What we see is an attempt to conceal the encrypted payload in a file that appears, perhaps to the casual observer, to be a signed, legitimate signed Windows executable. DL hollowing was also used. This is a technique that was, I believe, first published in 2019. It's not that well known. I don't believe it's widely used, but it was designed initially to circumvent sort of memory forensic frameworks and how they go about identifying sort of process injection using techniques that have been around a while. So at each step in the execution chain, we see greater consideration for kind of evading detection, but also slowing down the instant response and reverse engineering processes. So that's sort of execution chains in a snapshot. I've covered the Bronze Atlas example. This isn't just about one threat group. We've seen multiple Chinese threat groups and know of multiple Chinese threat groups that are using this approach, using 4, 5, 6 files, 4, 5, 6 steps to get their malware loaded into memory, with the same view of attempting to evade detection and slowing down the instant response and reverse engineering processes. So I expect we'll see more of this in the future. Now I'm going to talk about network perimeter and beyond, and we're going to use particular bronze spiral activity that we publicly blogged about earlier on this year. And we're going to use that sort of case study for certainly some of this activity. So one common approach that we've seen by all sorts of threat groups over the years, from those that are state-sponsored espionage groups to post-intrusion ransomware groups, is that they will look to scan and exploit a vulnerable server and then deploy their malware. Could be custom, could be commodity, to the network. And while this is absolutely still effective, we have seen sort of greater consideration from the Chinese threat actors to blend in with legitimate business communications. Perhaps that's because the organization they're targeting is more capable in some way, or perhaps it's more sensitive based on the geography or the sector that they operate in. So how can, taking that first example, how can a threat actor blend in more? Well, remote working has become increasingly popular for obvious reasons over the last 12 to 18 months. And I believe that Chinese threat groups like Bronze Spiral are using this and identifying this as an opportunity to blend in with legitimate business traffic. So using Bronze Spiral as a specific example, we observed them compromising a SOHO router in the same country as the target organization, and then they routed their traffic through the compromised router and then used stolen credentials from a previous intrusion to VPN into the network, and from there they used living off the land executables to achieve attempt to achieve their objectives. So if we look at this, what can network defenders see? Well, if you take the example of the remote workers and the threat actors, and you look at, say, VPN logs that record the public IP, the source IP of the VPN activity, and we use the US as an example, what the network defender will see is sort of legitimate users logging into the network from US ISP IP address broadband pools. So this is unlikely to sort of stand out on its own if we were to inspect this type of activity in our logging data. But how do we stop this activity? Well, multi-factor authentication is a key aspect here, and implementing that correctly will prevent, I would say, most of this type of activity. But it's important that MFA is implemented correctly, because we have seen examples of where MFA has been applied to endpoints on the perimeter, but not implemented correctly. So the threat actor has been able to, in one instance, attempt to log in with credentials that they had stolen, and then they were able, because of the way the MFA was implemented, to effectively send a one-time password to a separate inbox that they also had access to, and then use that as a second factor authentication method to gain access to the network. So MFA is key here, but it has to be implemented correctly. And in terms of living off the land executables, while that likely will blend in more than, say, dropping certain malware families to the network, the way in which threat actors use living off the land binaries to achieve their goals around moving laterally across the network or exfiltrating data will stand out compared to how sort of your standard users are using living off the land executables. So here, process creation and execution telemetry is key across the network, because there are signatures that are created that we can create to detect living off the land executables being used by threat actors, because they will use different arguments, they will use different commands as they attempt to achieve their goals, which are obviously different to sort of standard users. What if MFA exists? How can a threat actor better blend into the network without dropping malware? Well, with Bronze Spiral, again, after they were locked out, we observed them come back and exploiting a zero-day vulnerability in a SolarWinds Orion server. But instead of dropping malware to the network, they actually Trojanized a legitimate file, and they embedded the Supernova web shell, which they then used to connect into the network. So with this, if the initial exploitation activity is not detected, it can be difficult, but not impossible to detect the broader malicious activity. With this, I would say defense in depth is key here. So I suspect I'm preaching to the choir here, but you want to ensure that your sort of perimeter servers are protected by security appliances like firewalls and IDS devices, and that they're fully patched. While that may not help with the zero-day vulnerability, most of the time it's not a zero-day vulnerability that we're seeing being used to exploit a network. We're seeing known vulnerabilities being exploited. So here, what I would say is ensure that your internet-facing servers are fully patched, but you have processes in place to patch them in a timely manner, obviously before these threat actors have an opportunity to operationalize and exploit those vulnerabilities. And like I say, the main issue with this is not zero-day vulnerabilities necessarily, it's the exploitation of known vulnerabilities. And we see lots of Chinese threat groups operationalizing very quickly after a vulnerability is publicized to exploit networks that are part of their sort of targeting list. In terms of both 0 days and known vulnerability exploitation, again, I would say process creation telemetry is key to detect the activity. So with Bronze Spiral, we saw them run a number of reconnaissance commands once through the Supernova web shell once they got access, and that appeared as child processes under the legitimate SolarWinds Orion process. We could see them running commands as child processes like ipconfig, system info, various net use commands as they tried to sort of orient themselves on the network. So again, with this type of activity, process creation telemetry is key to detect this. And across the board, one point I'd like to drive home is that defense in depth is the way to hopefully detect this activity, even when the threat actors are attempting to blend in with legitimate business traffic. To sum up, like I said, we've seen leveling up of activity around the network perimeter and beyond. Again, there are considerations from the threat groups around what the network defender can observe and detect. And this is broader than just Bronze Spiral. We're aware of multiple Chinese threat groups that are using this approach, exploiting SOHO, small office, home office routers in their sort of target countries and then routing traffic through it in an attempt to blend in. So again, we're likely to see more of this activity in the future. And hopefully today I've given you a sort of appreciation of how Chinese threat groups are improving their operational security. I covered execution chains and infrastructure that they're using. I touched upon sort of greater tradecraft and tool sharing in country, particularly around sort of PLA reforms and the use of ShadowPad malware. And hopefully I've highlighted sort of the challenges that network defenders face, but importantly also the opportunities for detecting this type of activity, even as Chinese threat groups sort of up their game. And I think that's it from me.
Thank you, Marc. We've got time for hopefully just one or two questions. A reminder that the audience can ask questions in the Q&A tab. First question, have we seen any knowledge or tradecraft sharing from Chinese groups besides what you've covered today?
Yeah, hafnium activity is probably a good example of that. So I suspect many people will be aware of that sort of activity that occurred earlier this year, where we saw multiple Chinese threat groups exploiting vulnerable Exchange servers before, sort of as 0 days before the vulnerability was publicly acknowledged by Microsoft. We also saw the Chinese threat groups exploiting the vulnerability after Microsoft announced or made public the vulnerability as well. So we saw this sort of confluence of Chinese threat groups all exploiting the same vulnerability on an Exchange server before it's made public and after it's made public, but without sort of public exploits being made available online. So what we think we saw there was likely an unprecedented level of sort of tradecraft sharing, exploit sharing within China across multiple threat groups. And there have been at least a dozen Chinese threat groups linked to this type of activity. We observed directly a number of clusters under this sort of hafnium campaign, including some of the more sort of opportunistic targeting, the scan and exploit stuff that occurred before the vulnerability was made public. But we also saw threat groups like Bronze Union attempting to exploit the vulnerability after, or the vulnerabilities after the sort of vulnerability was made public in an attempt to get back into networks we had previously sort of kicked them out of. So I would say the Hafnium cluster campaign was a really good example of how Chinese threat groups seem to be sharing kind of knowledge in Tradecraft more than ever, perhaps at an unprecedented level. That may be enabled by some of the PLA reforms, although we did see both threat groups, so threat groups linked to both the PLA and the MSS exploiting this vulnerability early on. So that's probably a good example from earlier on this year.